Welcome to another deep dive. This time it's something that honestly affects everyone listening, no matter what you do. Productivity. But not just plain old productivity, we're going way deeper than that. Today we're talking about the human side of productivity.
Yeah, exactly. It's about more than just squeezing more output out of people.
Right. So we've got this awesome report from the International Labor Organization.
The ILO.
The ILO, right.
It really gets into how countries can boost their productivity but without, burning out their workforces. It's called Human-Centered Approach to Increasing Workplace Productivity, Evidence from Asia. Came out in 2023.
I love that. So is it basically asking, can we actually get sustainable growth if we make employee well-being, skills, decent working conditions? If we actually prioritize that stuff, can we get sustainable growth?
Yeah, that's the big question. And what's really interesting is they compare these four very different economies: China, India, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. Each one is tackling these human-centered productivity challenges in a totally different way.
Okay, so before we go country by country, can you break down what this human-centered approach actually means? In practice, what does it look like?
Well, the ILO, they use this term high road HRM, and it's about seeing your employees as valuable assets, not just cogs in a machine,
Right.
So imagine a company that, really invests in training their employees, creates a culture where, people can speak openly. They actually listen to feedback from their employees. So they're not just focused on hitting those quarterly targets, but really building a workforce that's, engaged, motivated, and committed to the company's long-term success. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. That sounds in theory.
Yeah.
But does it actually get results, in the real world?
Well, the report says yes. They've got some pretty compelling evidence. For example, companies that do this high road HRM, they tend to have way higher job satisfaction, lower turnover rates.
Makes sense.
They're not constantly having to, spend all this time and money recruiting and training new people all the time because people actually like working there.
Right.
Yeah.
If you treat people well, they want to stay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get specific. You mentioned China. Now, their economic growth has been insane over the past few decades.
It's been incredible.
But the report kind of points out this paradox. Their labor productivity is still, compared to places like Japan and the Republic of Korea, it's still pretty low. Why is that?
Well, a big factor is that reliance on low-wage labor. A lot of their success was built on being, quote unquote, the world's factory.
Yeah.
But if they want to move up the value chain, that model is not going to be sustainable in the long term.
Right. It's like they hit a ceiling. You can only go so far with low wages and just cranking out tons of stuff, right?
Exactly. And then on top of that, they've got this huge regional disparities. Some areas are booming, high-tech industries, while others are kind of stuck in these lower productivity sectors.
Okay, so they need to shift gears, but where do they even start?
Well, education and skills development, those are key.
Okay.
The report highlights this crazy statistic. China's producing a ton of university graduates.
Really?
Yeah. The largest tertiary educated workforce in the world. But a lot of them don't actually have the skills businesses need.
So it's not just about the quantity of education, it's the quality too, right?
Right. It's a mismatch. Imagine you're this bright young person in China, you graduate with a degree in robotics engineering, and you can't find a job.
Yeah.
But all these companies are desperate for software developers. So you spend years, honing these specialized skills, but the jobs aren't there.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. I can see why that would totally hold back their productivity. So what role's the government playing in this? Are they doing anything to help fix it?
Yeah, they're aware of the problem, for sure. And the report mentions they've made some efforts, to boost human capital development.
Okay.
But there are limitations. For one, their government spending on education as a percentage of GDP, it's relatively low compared to other, developed countries. And then there's also this big issue of, unequal access to quality education, especially if you're in a rural area.
So it sounds like China's got a long way to go. What about private businesses? Are they stepping up to kind of fill that gap?
Some are, and the report actually points out this interesting trend. Research shows that if you increase the proportion of highly educated women in Chinese companies, especially smaller firms, that can really boost their performance.
It's really interesting. It sounds like they're missing out on a lot of potential there.
Absolutely. Tapping into that potential could be huge for them, but it requires, a bit of a shift in mindset.
For sure. All right, let's move on to another economic powerhouse, India. Now, they've also seen massive growth, But the report highlights a very different set of challenges when it comes to productivity. What are they dealing with?
Well, in India, a huge chunk of their economy is informal. Like, we're talking small businesses, street vendors, all this unregistered activity.
Okay.
It's vital to their economy, but it makes it really hard to measure, track productivity.
Because it's not officially tracked anywhere.
Right, exactly.
And I'm assuming the working conditions are probably very different in that kind of setting than in like a big formal company.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They often lack basic social protections, decent working conditions, health insurance even. And without those things, it's hard for people to be productive. They can't really contribute to the economy in a meaningful way.
Right. Now, here's something I found surprising. The report says that India has like pretty strict labor laws, on paper at least.
Right.
But companies often find ways to kind of get around them. How does that work?
Yeah, you've got these laws in place to, protect workers. But the reality is, enforcement is weak. Companies exploit loopholes. Sometimes they just straight up ignore the regulations.
So are the laws just like useless then?
Well, not completely, but it does lead to this rise in what they call like contractual employment.
Okay.
Jobs that don't offer much security, benefits are low, and when people are constantly worried about like their next paycheck or if they'll even have a job tomorrow, it's tough for them to be productive.
It's like a vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
Low wages, low productivity, and no one's investing in, actually giving people the skills they need to move up.
Exactly. And on top of that, the report says that over 80% of businesses in India are saying they've got a massive skills shortage, like huge talent gaps. That's a major roadblock for their economy.
Yeah.
Imagine you're this business owner, you're ready to expand, create new jobs, but you can't find workers with the skills you need.
Yeah, that's super frustrating. So what's the solution? Just push everyone to get a traditional university degree?
It's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, the report highlights the low uptake of vocational training in India as a big problem. There's this kind of cultural thing where vocational training is seen as less prestigious than a traditional academic path. But that's starting to change.
So we're talking about like hands-on practical skills that you can apply directly to jobs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there are some cool things happening in India. The report mentions this ILO score training program as a good example. Even small, medium-sized businesses can make real improvements by investing in their workers this way.
Can you tell me more about how this training program works?
Yeah, so it focuses on practical skills development and also, importantly, improving cooperation between workers and employers.
So it's not just technical skills, it's like the whole relationship between workers and managers.
Right. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued, respected, and actually empowered to contribute their ideas. And the report has this case study, this company in India, JP Enterprises, and they went through the SCORE training, and the results were pretty amazing. They built a much stronger worker-employer relationship, and as a result, their productivity shot up, and they actually saw a reduction in workplace accidents. It was a pretty incredible turnaround.
That's amazing. Going from a place where like management and workers are at odds to actually working together.
Yeah, exactly. It shows that these human-centered approaches, they're not just about being, nice. They're about creating a better work environment where everyone can thrive.
Okay, so we talked about China, we talked about India. Coming up, we'll explore Japan and the Republic of Korea and how they're tackling human-centered productivity. You might be surprised at what we find. Okay, so we've seen how China and India are dealing with these pretty big challenges when it comes to boosting productivity, but also keeping their workforce happy, engaged. Now let's head over to Japan. Now, you might be surprised to hear that Japan is facing a declining potential growth rate.
Yeah, that's right. And one factor in this decline is actually their shrinking working hours.
Wait, really? Japan? I mean, they're practically famous for like their super long working hours, that really intense work culture. Are you saying all those like extra hours were actually good for productivity?
Well, the thing is, the link between working hours and productivity is actually really complicated. It's not just this simple, like, more hours equals more output kind of thing. The report actually suggests that, maybe this decrease in those really long working hours could actually be good for productivity over the long term.
Okay, I'm curious. How so?
Well, think about it. If you're constantly working overtime, pulling all-nighters, never getting a break, you're going to burn out, right?
Yeah.
You're more likely to have health problems, just general fatigue. And that's not good for anyone, especially not their productivity.
Right. A well-rested employee is probably a much better employee. But isn't there a risk of, you know, going too far in the other direction? Can too much rest actually be bad for productivity?
That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a balance. The report isn't saying people should be, lazy or anything, but it suggests that maybe Japan's shift towards shorter hours could lead to a more sustainable, more productive workforce overall. It's about working smarter, not necessarily longer.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What else is the report saying about Japan's challenges?
Well, another interesting thing is this rising number of what they call non-regular workers.
Non-regular, okay.
So these are folks on, temporary contracts, part-time roles, often with fewer benefits and less job security than like your typical, regular employee.
So how does that affect the overall productivity?
Well, it kind of creates this two-tier system in companies, right?
Oh.
You've got your core group of employees, they're invested in, they get the training, they're seen as like long-term assets. And then you've got this growing group of, these non-regular workers. They're kind of treated as more disposable, less access to training, development opportunities.
And that doesn't sound very human-centered.
Not really. It can lead to like lower morale, higher turnover among those non-regular staff, and just a general sense of inequality in the workplace. And if you feel undervalued, insecure in your job, it's hard to be really productive and engaged, right?
Right. So it sounds like Japan's got some work to do in terms of creating a work environment that's more equitable and supportive.
Yeah.
What about gender diversity? How are they doing on that front?
Well, that's another area where they're facing some pretty big challenges. The report says that Japan has a really small proportion of female CEOs, especially compared to other developed countries. They actually rank near the bottom for female representation in leadership roles.
Wow, that's a pretty big gap. It seems like they're missing out on a lot of potential leaders there.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder if maybe Japan's traditional corporate culture, which can be pretty, hierarchical, male-dominated, is actually holding them back from fully embracing this more human-centered approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are they doing anything to address this gender imbalance? Is the government encouraging companies to promote more women into leadership positions?
Yeah, the report mentions some government efforts to promote gender equality, like they've got these policies to try to increase the number of women in management and also to, encourage work-life balance for both men and women.
Okay. And is it working? Are those efforts making a difference?
Well, it's a slow process, and the progress has been pretty incremental.
I see.
There are still big cultural barriers to overcome, but there are some encouraging signs. More companies are recognizing that diversity is a good thing, and they're starting to, put in place programs to support women's career advancement.
It sounds like they're moving in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our final Asian economy, the Republic of Korea. I always think of them as super high-tech, almost futuristic. How does that play into their approach to productivity?
Yeah, the Republic of Korea is a really interesting case. They've embraced automation and technology in a big way, especially in their manufacturing sector. They actually have the highest robot density of any country. So more robots per worker than anywhere else in the world.
Wow, that's amazing. But I'm guessing it's more than just robots, right?
You're right. While they've been leaders in, adopting new technologies, the report says they haven't been quite as successful in implementing those high-performance work practices and organizational structures that we often associate with a human-centered approach.
So it's like they've got the technology, but maybe haven't given as much thought to the human side of things.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And it raises this really interesting question. Can a technology-focused approach really coexist with a human-centered one? Or are they just fundamentally at odds?
I mean, they have to coexist, right? We can't just replace all human workers with robots and expect everything to be fine.
Yeah, you're right. And Korea is a great example of a country trying to figure out how to navigate that intersection between technology and human capital. The challenge for them, and really for all of us, is figuring out how to use technology to enhance human capabilities, create better jobs, not just, automate existing ones out of existence.
That's a good point. So what are some specific challenges Korea is facing when it comes to building this more human-centered work environment?
Well, one concern the report brings up is this increasing prevalence of non-regular labor and what they call fissured workplaces.
Fissured workplaces.
Yeah. Basically, it's this trend where work is becoming more and more fragmented and outsourced, often leading to lower wages and job security for workers.
So it's like the gig economy, but on a much larger scale.
Kind of, yeah. And it can make it really hard for workers to, build their skills and have stable careers. And it makes it hard for companies to, create that cohesive and loyal workforce.
Sounds like it could lead to a lot of instability and anxiety for both workers and companies.
Exactly. But it's not all doom and gloom. The report also has these really inspiring case studies of Korean companies that are doing things differently, and they're seeing amazing results by using these human-centered work practices.
Okay, give us some hope here. Tell us about these success stories. So we just heard about some of the downsides of how work is structured in Korea, but you mentioned some companies doing things differently, right? Like companies getting positive results.
Yeah, for sure. The report actually highlights a few companies that have really embraced the human-centered approach, and they're seeing some really impressive results. One of them is this company called Yuhan Kimberly. They're a consumer goods company. And back in the 1990s, they had this major business crisis.
What happened?
Well, they were dealing with declining sales, increased competition. They even had a worker strike. It was a really tough time.
Sounds rough.
But instead of resorting to layoffs or cost cutting that would hurt their employees, they took a totally different approach.
Interesting. So what'd they do?
Well, they actually worked with the labor union. Can you believe that?
Wow.
To develop a new system. They focused on shorter working hours, more training opportunities, and the skills-based pay system. So basically, they invested in their employees instead of just getting rid of them.
That's pretty radical, especially during a crisis. Did it work?
It did. They saw a big jump in productivity. Employee retention went way up. And they created this really unique and collaborative partnership between management and labor.
So it's like they used that crisis to totally rethink how they approached their whole work structure, right?
Exactly. They realized their employees weren't just costs, They were valuable assets who could really contribute to the company's success.
I love that. What other examples are in the report?
Well, another great case study is LG Electronics. They did something pretty bold. They implemented a no layoff policy.
Wow.
So even in tough economic times, their employees had job security. And they also switched to a skills-based pay system. So employees were rewarded for, learning new skills and taking on more responsibility.
Did that strategy work? It seems risky, to guarantee job security, especially in a competitive industry.
It did work. Their employees reported really high levels of job satisfaction, and they were able to attract and keep top talent, even when the economy was uncertain. Turns out that investing in your employees and giving them security actually helps the bottom line.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
It really goes against that old idea that employees are just extendable. What's the last case study?
Okay, the last one is P.O. Esco. It's a steel maker, and they're known for their crazy high labor productivity. And one of the things that makes them so successful is this focus on what they call employee-involved workplace innovation. So they've built a culture where workers can come up with new ideas, new solutions.
So it's not just top-down management telling everyone what to do. It's about getting input from everyone, tapping into their knowledge and creativity.
Exactly. And it's worked really well for them. They've developed some seriously groundbreaking products and processes, all thanks to their employees.
Okay, so we've looked at these four economies: China, India, Japan, the Republic of Korea. They're all so different. But are there any common threads or takeaways we can apply to, thinking about productivity, no matter where we work or what we do?
I think a big takeaway is that this human-centered approach isn't just some fluffy idea. There's real data that shows investing in employees, creating a supportive environment, encouraging collaboration that leads to real benefits, not just for the employees, but for the company's success too.
Makes sense. If people are happy, engaged, and they have the right skills, they're going to be more productive and more innovative, right?
Exactly. And another point is that there's no magic formula that works for everyone. What works in one place might not work somewhere else. Each country has its own unique challenges and opportunities.
So it's about figuring out what works for your specific situation, right? Your company, your industry.
For sure. And it's also important to remember this isn't just the responsibility of CEOs or HR. It's something we can all work on.
So if I'm not a CEO, what can I do? Are there any practical tips to, promote a more human-centered approach where I work?
Well, start by just asking questions. Is your company investing in your skills, your well-being? Do you feel valued at work? Are you able to contribute your ideas?
Good starting points. But what if the answer to those questions is no?
Then don't be afraid to speak up. Talk to your coworkers, your manager. The more we push for better conditions, the more likely things are to change.
That's good advice. And for people in leadership, take a look at how you do things. Are you empowering your employees? Are you creating an environment where people can take risks, share ideas, and learn from their mistakes?
Yeah, it's about leaving behind that old way of thinking where workers are just like cogs in a machine and moving toward a future of work where everyone's potential is unleashed and everyone benefits.
I love that. It's inspiring, but it also feels possible.
Totally. It's not some impossible dream. It's about making those small changes that can add up to something really big.
Well said. And if anyone wants to learn more about this, definitely check out the work the ILO is doing. And there's tons of research on human-centered management practices. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information out there.
We'll put some links in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the human side of productivity. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future of work for everyone.